Hello everyone and welcome back to Classic Dune. And today I wanted to talk about homebrew, how to make good homebrew, and specifically factions for this video, but maybe future entry could talk about variants. And the main reason is because I feel like Dune is a board game that's uniquely suited to homebrew. I've never really seen any other game that has such an active community for homebrew, except maybe something like Twilight Imperium. And I think it's probably just because the lore is so rich, and Dune as a game is very thematic. If you ask me, the most thematic game, but just generally, it's a very thematic game, and so you can't help but read the book, see an interesting organization, and think, I wonder if I could make them into a faction. And so I'm going to tell you the things I've learned in making my own factions. I've got four of them here that'll make a special guest. Just got them hidden right now for extra drama and suspense. But yeah, how to make good homebrew factions. Because it's actually really hard. It's quite difficult. I see a lot of homebrew that people definitely put a lot of effort into, but you read it and it's like, I'm not sure how well that might actually pan out in a game. And the other reason is a lot of tables in Dune are very different. Dune is a game where table metas are very impactful in terms of how the game goes and what strategies work. And so I can imagine a lot of times there's a faction which could be very good and very fun depending on what table it's played at. Like if you think about Atreides at a table where nobody makes deals and nobody makes bribes and there's no trading of any kind of information, playing Atreides is probably not as fun as in a table where everyone is, making deals left and right and bribing for this and trading information. And in that case, Atreides is a dream, and you might end one turn with like 12 spice in your bidding pile that you're gonna collect. It's crazy. So I'm gonna start off with the big main idea, and that is when you're thinking of a faction and trying to design a faction, design in reverse. If you ask me, the last thing you should be making is writing down abilities on a faction sheet. That's the last thing you should do, because I think you want to try to design for the end result. You want to design for moments, feelings, or board states that don't often happen. So you want to try to create a faction that can influence the game and create these new experiences and new situations. And so you want to design in reverse. You don't want to design mechanics. You don't want to design for mechanics. And again, everything I say, there's going to be borderline exceptions, but you don't want to design to introduce, a specific mechanic into the game. You want to design to say, you know what? I want to be in this weird situation where I just got this feeling. There's a move that I would normally do every time, but in this unique circumstance, because of the faction I'm playing, or just that this faction is in the game, I don't want to do that certain move. To give a little bit of validity to this, even though I didn't design these factions, but think about it like the Moritani. They have these terror tokens, and they create the situation where it's like, oh, Air Keen is open. Why wouldn't I go in there to get the Ornithopters? Oh, well, there's a terror token there, and if you've seen any of their effects, you really don't want to do it just willy-nilly. Or you look at Chome. They're created to make treachery cards as a unique resource that they can manipulate and spend in different ways. They're all about controlling treachery cards. They've got the bigger hand limit. They've got the uses for worthless cards. They've got the ability to trade cards with their allies. That's their whole thing. Or again, mention Atreides. What if knowledge was an important commodity that you can buy and sell? Well, there you go. That's the Atreides. And all of these things, they don't just impact the way you play the game if you are said faction. They impact the way everyone plays the game. So even if you are not playing a particular faction, you will feel their presence or even their absence. If you think about games where there's no Atreides or there's no Ixians, I mean, you can definitely feel it. And so those, in my opinion, are the best factions in Dune, are the ones where you really feel it when they're introduced. And so that's why you want it designed to create those things. You don't just want it to kind of happen all of a sudden. You know, you don't want to get lucky. Now, how do you go about doing this? Well, the best way to do it is to just keep playing more games of Dune. Uh, I remember hearing one of the original designers of Dune, I think it was Peter Latka, but I remember hearing either him say or someone paraphrasing him say that sometimes some of the best ideas for Dune or Cosmic, which they also designed, come about where you're playing the game normally and you just get put into a situation and it's like, oh man, I really wish I could do this one specific thing right now. That would be great. And you know what? That could be a perfect ability. Maybe not even that like main big idea for a faction, but just a neat little bonus. Like, for example, trading cards with your ally as Chom. I mean, I've had that idea since maybe even the first handful of games of Dune I've played. It's such an interesting thing, and when you have it, it can be really nice to have to kind of collude with your ally and work out who would be best to have which card. A classic thing is the Tleilaxu. Even before they came out, they were probably one of the most frequently homebrewed factions, was getting revival payments and having the ability to manipulate the revival phase and the tanks and just dealing with dead forces. Or the Rishes is another very common, not them specifically as a homebrew, but the idea of selling cards. A bit of a variant emperor in terms of gaining income from them. So these kind of situations where I wish I could do something, well, you know what? Go and design the faction that can do that thing. The other thing I'm going to say about how to get these ideas is to really leverage the books, leverage the lore of Dune. Again, that's one of the reasons why I think that Dune is such a homebrewed game, is because of the lore, but really draw on the lore, draw on the books, and just read them. They're all great, especially the Brian Herbert books. People give them flack, but I love those books. They're great reads, very interesting stories, and really interesting characters and factions in them. But there's so many times where I'll read a part of Dune, any of the books, and I'll say, oh man, a situation like that would be really cool to have it in the board game. You know, like the Mauritani Terror tokens. They pulled off a number of different hijinks. You know, they pulled off a sneak attack against the Ginaz. They did an assassination attempt against the Ikaz during a wedding. They sabotaged. They had these like mines under like a battleground, and they detonated them, and it collapsed. It caved in, and it killed the whole army. They sabotaged the structure. So, you know, all those terror tokens come from a part in, I believe it's Paul of Dune, has got a lot of the Mauritani. Every single one of those tokens has an inspiration behind it. And so that's really the best way to get interesting ideas, to read the books and just be open to see an interesting scene and say, what if there was a power or a faction in Dune that made me feel like I was reenacting the scene, but in the board game? And then I'm going to talk about some other general things, like in terms of writing out your abilities. It's a bit of a pet peeve of mine. You don't have to do it, but I generally don't like it when a faction references other factions or mechanics or variants unless it needs to, right? So like an example of where you have to do that is like the Emperor. Their Sardaukar forces have no effect against the Fremen. That is an exception, but it's because it has a reason, because it's neat and thematic. It doesn't do that much to nerf the Emperor, but it's really cool when you do see it, when you see an Emperor with a bunch of Sardaukar fighting against Fremen, and what would have been a guaranteed almost win is now kind of shaky, or even a loss, just because of that cool lore tidbit that the Sardaukar are no match for Fremen. So, another example would be the Mauritani. Right. Yeah, so the Ikaz and the Mauritani, I believe it's the enemy of my enemy advantage cannot be triggered by the Ikaz, or maybe it's the Ikaz and Ambassador, they can't form an alliance with the Mauritani. So that's, you know, one of those exceptions to that rule, but it had it exists because it has an interesting thematic link. It's because the Ikaz and the Mortani really hate each other's guts. So I find it, you know, it kind of reads cleaner if you're not bringing up other factions or other variants unless you need to. Like, for example, on the ECAS sheet, Duke Vidal cannot be assigned a leader skill. Or maybe it's the Chom Auditor. Definitely the Chom Auditor. I'm not sure about Duke Vidal. I don't remember. But yeah. Let's see if I got anything else written down here. Oh, and another big thing is, so once you've thought of the situation, the feeling, the board state that you want to design for, do so with one big eye-catching advantage. That's, I think, the best takeaway from this is you want to have one advantage that really captures people's attention, and you say, oh, this faction has this ability, damn, now I want to try them out. I mean, the flashy one for, let's say, you know, the Atreides is that card knowledge. Or you have the Harkonnen and the fact that they have so many traitors and they get extra treachery cards. Or the Emperor is just that they're rich. They're incredibly rich all the time. Those are what make people want to play a faction. And they're a published faction. They're one of the originals, but the Fremen, I think, are not as great in retrospect. Just because they have a lot of half advantages. They have a lot of advantages that are great in a vacuum if they were put onto, you know, a stronger faction. But they don't really have a kind of a main ability other than maybe their deployment, but it's not really that flashy. And now they're a great faction, very fun to play, but that is kind of one thing that they could be improved upon if there was ever a Dune 2 or something, is, you know, a redesigned Fremen with most of the same abilities, but some big kind of cornerstone. Maybe like some ability to control worms and have them on the board as units or something. So yeah, and now I'm going to go into a segment where I'm going to talk about these ideas more specifically with respect to some of my homebrew factions. I've got 4 of them here in order of, actually I'm not even sure if they're chronological order, but they're an order, and it was chosen specifically. So we're going to start off with my first homebrew, which is the Honored Matres. So this is kind of, you know, you read Dune, and if it's not the Tleilaxu, if it's not the Ixians, the Honored Matres are like the holy grail of homebrew factions. Everybody wants to make one. And honestly, there's not that much told about them in the books, which makes it very difficult to make them a good and interesting faction. And this is probably my worst designed faction, just by right of it being the oldest. But one of the interesting things I wanted to create with this one was an alternative currency, that being adrenaline. Oh yeah, also loose kind of spoilers for all the factions that I talk about here. Nothing big like, oh, this guy dies, but, you know, it might be more helpful to have read the book that they're from. Yeah, so, but the idea here was adrenaline and how they use it as like an alternative to spice. I thought that was very interesting, and I wanted to see what the Honored Matres could do by introducing adrenaline as an alternate currency that they had this unique control over. And, you know, they create it and it kind of disrupts the game, especially with other factions that require spice to do things, like the Emperor. And so the main idea with adrenaline was that you could convert spice into adrenaline. And that's not exactly thematic, but it is one way to do it. And it's a way for them to kind of scale similarly to other factions, despite having this alternate currency, which is most factions get stronger when they have more spice. And so just in the same way, the Honored Matres will also get stronger when they have more spice, because they can convert it into adrenaline. And what this did was, I had a lot of different iterations, but anytime you are going to pay for something, you can use adrenaline. And I don't actually know if that ability made it into this version, but it looks like for this, it's a spice substitute that you can use to power up your forces even more. So it's like double spice combat. I don't think this version ever got played, this version specifically, but I don't really think it would be a huge hit based on how many people kind of dislike spice combat. The other thing they have is the dominate ability, and if you've read Heretics and Chapter House, you'll have noticed that there's only 3 main Honored Matres characters, and I haven't read the 2 sequel books by Brian Herbert, but I'm sure there's more Honored Matres than those, but that would be Dama, Logno, and sort of Merbella. But since there's only 3 characters, and I didn't feel like putting in, generic Honored Matre 1 and 2, I decided to make one of their interesting selling points the fact that they only have 3 leaders. And in addition, because the Honored Matres were such fearsome opponents and so strong in combat, I made them all ridiculously strong. They're basically half of the Fremen leader pool, the upper half, that is. 7, 6, and 5, those are the strongest leaders in the game. And nicely as well, a member of the community was kind enough to make me some really nice looking illustrations instead of just my crude copies of Fenring, Kalia, and I'm blanking, Wana Yui. But yeah, so they have 3 leaders, and you would think, of course, well, they only have 3 leaders. That's a major nerf, so how do you compensate for it other than just saying they can revive their leaders early? Well, what I had was this thing where when your leader would be killed, it will instead, you can have the option of dominating their opponent. So they become captured kind of like Harkonnen would. And then, so they're still alive, and the moment they play that leader and they survive, they come back to you. So it's a way for your leaders to technically die, but you can get them back more easily, and more interesting than just you can revive them. And as with all of my homebrew factions, I put a lot of effort into making it look nice and as similar to the base game components. So I've got the BG silhouette here, but it's orange instead of blue. And the faction is orange because when the Honored Matres start to get pissed off, their eyes would turn orange, which was kind of crazy. All right, next up on the chopping block. Oh, and by the way, this faction is not good. They didn't really go over well in the one game I played of a similar version of this. Similar, but not exactly the same. Another not good faction here, we've got the God Emperor. And they're a very tough faction to design when you think about it, because in the books, the God Emperor, spoilers, was in control of basically everything. The most thematic and lore accurate God Emperor faction would be one where they have one ability and it just says, at the start of the game, you win. So in straying away from a thematic faction a little bit, I gave them real abilities. And the main thing with this faction, the main design idea was altering the board. You can kind of think of it like discovery tokens before those ever existed. And essentially, they could modify the board by terraforming different territories. So they had this thing where every turn you would draw a number of these terraform cards, which have every sand territory in the game on them, kind of like the Spice Blow cards. And God, what a waste of time this was, by the way. So that's one great thing. I spent all night making these. I looked out the window and it was 6 a.m. I'm like, oh my gosh, what am I doing? Anyways, yeah, so you get a number of these cards and you can place a terraform token in one of them. I believe this was in the Spice Blow phase. And there were these different types of terraforming tokens. I'm really trying not to say terror tokens by accident. And they would have different effects. So the forests would make the territory safe from storms and maybe worms. I can't remember. No. So just storms. The forests are safe from storms. Then there's the Kanats, which make them safe from worms, which makes sense because thematically, spoilers, worms are poisoned by water, and since this is an underground or something river, worms can't go there, so it's protected from worms. And then these grassland tokens are probably the most interesting one. It makes them count as not a territory for the purposes of a movement. So to say that in a way that makes more sense, let's say you've got forces here and you want to get to Silago West. If you move through the grassland, it doesn't count as a territory. So you could go from here to here in one move. Or if you had ornithopters, you could go 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, just like that. And this territory doesn't count. And normally you could not get from here to Habanya. This would be 1, 2, 3, 4. So that was sort of the interesting scenario I wanted to create with these tokens. And what that was specifically was, making a board that changes throughout the game and becomes different, creates new possibilities. You've never seen a game where you have someone camped out in Simpo because it's safe from the storm. Well, with this faction, you might have that scenario. And there were all sorts of other interesting ideas, like they could modify the values of spice blows with their tokens. They could make them worth more or less. Interesting idea for kind of bribing people to say, hey, I'll put the +6 token on this spice blow if you do this. And also to kind of convey the fact that Leto II had such a powerful control over the spice economy. And then there was an interesting fun ability where there's all these different Duncans. So there's a Duncan 7, 6, 3, and Traitor Duncan, who, when you play in a battle, your opponent can always call him Traitor. Now, why would you ever play that, and how do these come into play? Well, you have a generic Duncan token. I guess I didn't pull it out of the bag. Let's see. No, I guess I just don't have it saved. But there is a Duncan here without any symbol at all, and it's the hidden potential Duncan Idaho, if I can speak. And the idea is that you play him in a battle, and when you reveal him, you go and you shuffle these other Duncans with values, and you'd see which one you get. So the first time you play your Duncan, you're not sure how strong or how loyal he's going to be until you reveal it and you see, oh, look at that, it's the 3, I'm losing this battle now. Or, oh, it's the 7 and now I'm winning it. Or it's the Traitor Duncan and now my opponent can just call a traitor on me, which is to mimic, again, spoilers, but hey, that first or second scene where the old Duncan tries to assassinate Leto and gets killed. So yeah, that was an interesting idea, just to, evoke that part of the book where Leto II is constantly creating Duncan Idaho Golas for some reason. It's such a well-remembered part of that book and of the whole series that it would be a shame not to include it in a God Emperor faction. And then next up, we've got probably a faction nobody's going to recognize because it comes from one of the Brian books, but it's the League of Nobles. And you're going to immediately just be probably overwhelmed by the sheer number of leaders in this faction. And this idea is the idea that there's lots of leaders and they each provide you with abilities while they're alive. So you could see the prototype space folders, you only have it when Aurelius Venport, the inventor, not the inventor, but the creator of the Spacing Guild, person who really provided that leadership and grew it. You've also got feint tactics when Vorian Atreides is alive, or the Valiant Martyrs if you have Iblis Ginjo, who's kind of the leader of the jihad, the political leader who really roused the people into fighting. And this is from the prequel books during the Butlerian Jihad, where the humans fought bravely against Skynet, aka Omnius, to defeat them. Definitely one of the more controversial books. But hey, I enjoyed it enough to make a faction based on it, so here we go. But what really captured me about that book was all the really cool characters that were introduced. Completely never before seen. It's not like how, Brian loves including Hasimir Fenring, or Duncan Idaho into his stories. Those are existing characters, but these are totally new ones. And honestly, all of them were really cool and really interesting. And so I wanted to have a faction that could include all of them under one umbrella. And I thought, well, you know what? There's such interesting characters, and I'm already going to have a faction with 8 leaders, so why not make them special in their own right, which is that they each provide abilities to you that you can only use when that leader is alive. And so this is kind of like leader skills before leader skills existed. I believe I designed this either before I was playtesting or shortly after, but I think it was before expansion 2 came out. So this is mostly unrelated in any way to leader skills. But yeah, this was this idea that your leaders are important not just for what they can do for you in a battle, because obviously if you did just have 8 leaders, you wouldn't really care about your leader dying as long as you win the battle. But in this case, which leader you play in each battle is a really important choice, because you risk not only the leader, but you also risk the entire ability. And all of these abilities are really juicy. And then there's also 3 types of forces, just to really make sure this faction isn't simple or new player friendly in any way. Yeah, there's a lot going on here. But I do have a fondness for this faction. I've never gotten to play it in a real game, but I'm sure it would be completely ridiculous. And then last up here is my favorite faction, and the one that I think is the best designed and the healthiest for the game. And it's going to be the other holy grail of homebrew factions, which is the LRAT. And, I mean, come on, you can't not read Dune and want to make the LRAT as a faction. Just because they're so influential, and yet they're somehow not included in the game officially. So why not include the LRAT? Now, a lot of faction suggestions, not a lot of, just one, but I know there is one very outspoken person on Board Game Geek that really wants the Twilight Imperium agenda phase as a faction, and saying that the LRAT could be that that way to include it. Me personally, I hate the agenda phase in Twilight Imperium because it seems really cool at first, but it just gets completely bogged down in meta and efficient play that it becomes not so interesting and really slow. And Dune really does not need to be slowed down any more than it already is, so that immediately was not in consideration for me. What I found most interesting, actually, was this idea of a high council of the most influential great houses of the LRAT, and what benefits might be afforded to them for being included in this council, and also just the fact that the LRAT is able to choose who gets to be in the great house. Not the great house, in the high council. And I guess considered a great house. Because, I mean, you think about it, is the political standing of a faction, of a house, was always really important in the Dune books. Even down to the fact that, I guess you probably won't be spoiled by this, but spoilers, in the first book, Emperor Shaddam IV makes this whole conspiracy to destroy House Atreides because he was becoming so impactful and influential in the LRAT that he was threatened by his power. And so he did all that. And it's like, well, what if you could reenact this in the books? What if you could be the LRAT and give people these high council seats? So what do? Well, they get you extra spice collection whenever someone who is in the high council collects spice. So it's sort of this way, kind of how, you know, the Harkonnens were the ones harvesting spice on Dune. Well, they didn't just keep that for themselves, they had to distribute it through Chom to the other great houses and individuals in the LRAT. And so this is kind of a take on that, is whenever a member of the High Council harvests spice, every other High Council member benefits, but it comes from the bank, so that it's not a penalty, it's a straight bonus. The other thing that High Council does is it lets members of it declare canly. So if a member of the High Council, let's see, So when any other player ships or moves forces into someone else's territory, if either player is a member of the High Council, they can attempt to declare Canley, in which case you have to approve it. If they're both on the High Council, though, they can declare it and resolve it, and it doesn't matter what you say. And what Canley is it's very simply a battle plan that only involves, let's see here. Yeah, no, they just fight instantly. So they don't wait for the battle plan, for the battle phase. They just fight right then and there. And let's see. There's a little reparations thing. I'm sorry, it's been a minute since I've looked at these factions, so I don't have them memorized. But initiating a battle during the shipment and movement phase, especially if it's caused by a shipment and that player doesn't have the opportunity to use their movement to leave immediately or maybe to capitalize on ornithopters, is a big deal. And so being able to declare Canley is actually very important, because you can very easily dissuade someone from shipping onto you just by saying, hey, if you come here, I'm going to declare Canley, and you're not going to get to use your ornithopters. And then there is this reinforcements thing. So I've got these different High Council seat tokens. So you got Alpha, Beta, and the other one that doesn't look like a letter. You will get a set of High Council LRAT reinforcement forces. So I think it was 5 of them, and they had their own unique free revival rate and limit of, I think it's, let's see here, 2. So you get one for free every turn in the revival phase as a free revival, in addition to your current free revivals. So that's really great. You get extra revivals and extra forces, and they also have a limit of 2 total per turn, so you can pay to revive another one. So that's honestly great. The Emperor has those Sardaukar, which are extra forces, and that's honestly such a strong ability because you have more forces to spread around the board. And imagine if you were the Emperor with a High Council seat and you're getting these extra forces. That's 30 strength worth of forces to spread around the board, which is nutty. And lastly, as you can see, the main draw of the LRAT is this High Council mechanic, and so all of the abilities are tied into it. That's another really important thing, which I don't think I mentioned, but you want to make sure that you have your big, important, flashy ability, but ideally, all of your other abilities should have some bit of synergy into it, just to integrate it, with exceptions, of course. But yeah, lastly, the alliance is, they don't make normal alliances. And this comes from, I'm sorry if you can hear the storm in the background, it's quite intense all of a sudden. But this comes from the idea in the books that, not even really in the books, but if you think about it, the LRAT as a collection of all the houses in the Imperium, they can't really be ride or die with any one organization, just because of how many voices there are. If Hundro Mortani really likes the Harkonnens and wants to throw his lot in with them, then eventually Archduke Armandi Kaz is going to protest and is going to put an end to it. Or, Earl Memnon Thorvald and whatnot, all those other characters. So they can only make alliances for 1 turn. The upside, though, is they can always make an alliance even if there was no Nexus phase. And in addition, that player must be on the High Council. So all that political red tape that they got to cut through, you can only ally with someone who is already on the High Council, and you can only do it for 1 turn, because, the LRAT only really deals with their own. And yeah, so that was kind of the idea, was to have this granting titles to other players, granting the title of High Council member, and having different abilities that would tie into it. Why do you want to be on the High Council? Well, you got to have some bonuses for it, and these are all those bonuses. You got the reinforcements, you got the alliances, and you've got the Spice Collection and the Declaration of Canley. All very good powers. And yeah, so that's really the faction. Oh, that's what it is. Your combat strength is increased. Your leader's combat value is increased by 1 for each player on the High Council, up to 3. And you can see that kind of is paralleled in the leaders. So the leaders are fairly weak. This is like Chome tier leaders, even worse actually. But once you get 3 people on the High Council, all of a sudden you have 7, 6, 5, 4, and 4. That would be the best leader setup in the game, even better than the Fremens. So yeah, that's where it comes from. And the last thing, the last tenet of how to make a good homebrew faction. I've saved it to the end, so I only distribute my secrets to the most devoted of viewers. This is honestly, it's the secret. It's the key. You do this one simple trick and you'll be designing amazing factions instantly with no effort. Just kidding. Designers hate this guy. You are designing to create moments, feelings, and board states that don't usually happen. So how is it that you're going to be successful in doing that? Well, it's playtesting. That is the secret. That's how you do it. If you can't do it, then you're just going to make ideas instead of factions. And these are all very cool ideas, and they look very pretty, but I don't think any of them have been played more than once or twice. Playtesting. That is how you make a good faction, because how are you going to know if you're creating these moments, these feelings, and these board states if you don't play the game to see how it works out? And honestly, that's it. That's the hardest part about making homebrew factions in Dune, especially making good ones, is playtesting, because you got to get... I mean, it's hard enough to play Dune, getting 5 other people who want to play this long, pretty complicated board game about what used to be, at least, a niche science fiction book. Now it's probably a little easier. That was the hardest part. Now you've got to convince 5 other people of that subset who want to sit through what is going to probably be your horrible faction that you've just finished designing. So that's really the hardest part. Once you start playing your faction and making tweaks and making changes and improving them and taking things away from it, then they're going to start to becoming really fun, really great factions. And I will speak to it. I was a playtester for Expansion 2, Chome and Richesse, but they had a bit of work done into them before I got on. But Ikaz and Moritani, I was there start to finish, and I can say Ikaz, the first draft, was the worst faction in Dune. Horrible. And it's not, insulting to Jack and the designers. It's just the way it is. Your first draft is always going to be the worst faction ever added to Dune. But now, it's my favorite. So, there you go. Playtesting. It's magical. Mortani was pretty interesting, but they were really bad. They were horrible. They were the hardest faction to win with, even more difficult than Richesse. So, that's quite the achievement. Again, not disrespectful. It's just, that's the way it was. And that's the way it'll be for any faction you make. They will be the worst, most unfun faction at the table, and they will either be the most broken faction or the most, not the weakest faction. And it's just about, moving through that growing pain period, because from pain will come pleasure. You eventually will, if you stick with it. You don't even have to be that great of a designer, but if you keep playing a faction and making changes to hopefully improve it, you will eventually get a good faction that's fun to play. And that's really all I can say on the matter. Thank you to anyone who has sat through probably the most ramble of a video I've made yet. But I hope you got some interesting ideas out of it. And honestly, spam the comments with all of your ideas. It could just be mechanics or moments, feelings, board states. It could be, organizations you'd like to see as a faction. Let's have a little chat about homebrewing factions, because I have been doing this. The moment I played all 6 factions in this game, the moment I had accomplished that goal, I had started thinking of ideas on how to make homebrew. And it really kickstarted my design fascination. Not really a career yet, but that's what started it all, is homebrewing factions in Dune. So I'd love to chat about it in the comments. And yeah, share your ideas. I got to end this video somewhere, so I'm going to end it right now. I'm going to say that's all I got for now. So until next time, I'll catch y'all later. Peace.